Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video I want to go through two key drivers of exchange rate movements. Any kind of currency around the world, there are so many different things that cause them to appreciate or depreciate. I want to focus on the Australian dollar. So these are drivers that strongly affect movements in the Aussie dollar. And what we're going to look at is we're going to look at demand for Australia's exports, and also we're going to take a look at interest rate differentials. So we're looking at this in the context of demand for Australia's exports changes. How does that affect demand for the Aussie dollar? And then interest rate differentials between Australia and the rest of the world, they change. What does that then mean for the Aussie dollar? Let's start with demand for Australia's exports. So Australia is an exporter of commodities, and the kind of commodities that other countries use to fuel their own economic growth. So these raw materials that countries import from Australia and then use them to create goods, to build factories, to further their own economic growth and development. So if we think about it, when the global economy is booming, when there is strong growth in countries around the world, they're going to need the raw materials that will help them to fulfill that growth, grow more quickly, and even grow for a longer period of time. So what they will do is they will look to countries that can provide them with those raw materials, to countries that can provide them with that fuel for growth, which could be Australia. So then in terms of Australia, if everybody is demanding Australia's exports, they're going to need to purchase Australian dollars, because Australian exporters don't really have much use for foreign currency because, well, they're in Australia and they're dealing a lot with Australian dollars. If, say, a company in China is really keen on getting iron ore from Australia, they're going to need to sell their Chinese currency, buy Aussie dollars to then buy the iron ore. So if there is a strong demand for Australia's exports, then there is strong demand for Australia's currency. So to put it even more simply, if there is increased demand for Australia's exports, there will be increased demand for Aussie dollars, which will lead to an appreciation of the currency. If we're thinking about the graph, we're looking at the demand curve shifting right. And the reason why it is the demand curve is because it relates to inflows to the balance of payments. It relates to money coming into Australia, and in order for that money to come into Australia in Aussie dollars, foreigners will have to sell their foreign exchange and buy Australia's currency. So if we're thinking about that particular driver, that the greater the demand for Australian exports, the greater the demand for Australia's currency, and the greater the appreciation of the Aussie dollar. So let's set exports aside for a second, and then let's look at this idea of an interest rate differential. So this concept of the interest rate differential is just like looking at what is the level of Australia's interest rates compared to interest rates around the world. And what happens is people who have some extra money and would like to save it in a bank kind of look all around the world to the country that will provide them the greatest return. And in terms of the return for saving, that involves the interest rate. So these foreigners are looking around the world and seeing which banks in which country will pay the highest interest rate for my savings. So if we think about this interest rate differential, we are comparing Australia's general level of interest rates with interest rates around the world. So let's take an example. Let's say that Australia's interest rates are relatively lower than those in America. So if someone had some additional funds, a little bit of savings, they might look to put that into America rather than Australia, because America offers higher interest rates. So then there would be greater demand for US dollars because they would need to change their local currency into American dollars to then deposit in the American banks. Likewise, if Australia's interest rates are relatively higher than those in America or even in other countries around the world, then that would likely cause an appreciation of the Aussie dollar, because if people want to save their money in Australia, they're going to need to change their foreign exchange into Aussie dollars, which will then increase demand for the Australian dollar and then push up the price of the Aussie dollar. So if we're thinking about it, that if Australia's interest rates are high relative to global interest rates, that will encourage foreigners to save their money in Australia, which will then increase demand for the Aussie dollar, which will then push up the value of the Australian dollar. Now, as I mentioned at the start, there are so many different factors that will affect the value of the Australian dollar. So much is traded and the value of the Aussie dollar changes on a sort of second by second basis. So it's hard to know exactly which will have the strongest impact. But in looking out there in the sort of foreign exchange markets, that demand for Australia's exports and Australia's interest rate differentials compared to the rest of the world do have a large impact in terms of the value of the Australian dollar. Something to add as well is that speculators, those people in the market that are sort of betting on the value of currencies to make profit, they will also influence the value of all currencies to an extent, perhaps even more so sometimes than interest rate differentials and demand for exports. But that's a different story. Okay, so hopefully this video was very useful in terms of your understanding about exchange rates and the kind of things that cause them to shift. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.